The Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research in the UK says this about the Paris climate change talks this past December. He says that the climate agreement delivered in Paris is a genuine triumph of international diplomacy. The international community, he says, not only acknowledged the seriousness of climate change, it also demonstrated sufficient unanimity to define it quantitatively. Yet, he says, it risks being total fantasy. And there's probably some truth in that. So on that happy note, what I propose to do this morning is to look at an overview of the Paris climate change talks, the COP21 meeting, and to provide a short analysis and assessment of the outcomes. I'll also look at implications for Australia and the role that Australia played in Paris. And I'll make some observations also about the euphoria following the Paris Agreement 8 months down the track, and whether in fact that euphoria is somehow misplaced. So, just by way of some very brief background, the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, entered into force in 1994, and it has almost universal state participation. Virtually all states have signed up to the UNFCCC. And what it does is simply provide a framework for future action and cooperation on climate change. So meetings of the UNFCCC are called Conferences of the Parties, or COPs, so COP21 in Paris last December. The Kyoto Protocol to that agreement, to the UNFCCC, did place legally binding limits on developed state parties' emissions for a period from 2008 to 2012, and it does so after a fashion for the period from 2012 to 2020. The Kyoto Protocol included no major emitter, and it's essentially come to an end. So then at COP17 in Durban in 2011, a working group was created to develop a legal instrument or an agreement with legal force under the UNFCCC, which would be applicable to all states, both developed and developing, to be finalised in December at COP21 in Paris and to take effect from 2020. So now we have the Paris Agreement, which is the focus of my comments this morning. Everything else, essentially, the UNFCCC and Kyoto, all fall away. It's now all about the Paris Agreement. So developed states now no longer have binding emissions reduction targets negotiated by all developed states together, which was the case under Kyoto, but rather now every state in the world, whether you're a developed state or a developing state, have non-binding, non-legally binding, what's known as intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs. So what INDCs do is to actually remove the need for states to agree on a single approach to climate change mitigation, or even really, I think, to disagree. Each state simply brings its own emissions reduction target to the table. So that at COP21, the targets, the INDCs, unlike Kyoto, were not in any way negotiated, they were simply stated, and they were pretty much all announced prior to COP21 in Paris. So no negotiation of emissions reduction targets. So that Paris Agreement could, it's been argued, have far-reaching implications. It establishes a more robust and durable architecture for international cooperation on climate change, and it contemplates a framework under which countries simply come forward with commitments on an ongoing basis. And all of that, of course, is true, but I think it's not the whole story. So I propose now just to look at the Paris Agreement. So firstly, in terms of temperature. So in clause 2.1, and there aren't many clauses to look at here, Clause 2.1 deals with temperature. And so it says that this agreement, the Paris Agreement, aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius, that's above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, recognising that this would significantly reduce the risks and the impacts of climate change. So on one view, it's just simply a statement of intent, but on another view, for the first time, an international climate agreement has at its heart a goal to not just hold warming below 2 degrees Celsius, but to hold warming well below that temperature. So on one view, that's actually quite remarkable. So Climate Action Tracker, which is a reputable, well-known independent analysis produced by a number of research organisations, it says that the national mitigation contributions, so those INDCs that I mentioned, taken together, associated with the Paris Agreement, would lead to a median warming of about 2.7 degrees by 2100, by year 2100. And the full range is 2.2 to 3.4. So compared to the 3.6 degrees Celsius by 2100 of warming that's projected to result from current policies, the climate pledges submitted through those INDCs in Paris lower warming by about 0.9 degrees, but that's only if all of the governments together fully implement those pledges, and that won't happen. And I think the analysis by Climate Action Tracker in terms of that range and that median broadly reflect most other analyses of those INDCs. And Article 4.1 then, which is only the second of the two articles that I'll look at, deals with emissions. So there's a temperature goal and there's an emissions goal. And in terms of emissions, the agreement says parties aim to reach global peaking of emissions as soon as possible, recognising that peaking will take longer for developing countries, and to undertake rapid reductions thereafter in accordance with best available science. So the Paris Agreement then, in addition to a temperature goal of well below 2 degrees Celsius, and it also refers to 1.5 degrees, provides for a targeted emissions peak through Clause 4.1 as soon as possible. So countries in Paris, in the Paris Agreement, through Clause 4.1, acknowledge that emissions have yet to peak and will continue to grow. It's the cornerstone of the Paris Agreement. We might look at commitments now. So the Paris Agreement, again, doesn't make those contributions legally binding. They're simply welcomed. So that in turn made it possible not only for states to actually sign up to the agreement, but on an optimistic view, to maximise the ambition of those pledges because they're not bound by them. So Article 3 says that the efforts of all of the parties will represent a progression over time. And though the content of those commitments is voluntary, the agreement does in fact underpin those contributions with a set of legally binding procedural requirements to promote transparency. So there are legal obligations with regard to those contributions in terms of the procedure and the administration of them, but in terms of the targets themselves, they're non-binding. And it's clear from the Paris Agreement that those NDCs, those INDCs, as currently submitted, are insufficient to meet the agreement's own emissions or temperature targets or goals. So that means that Article 4.3 of the Paris Agreement is actually quite crucial because it says that each party's successive nationally determined contribution will represent a progression beyond the party's then current nationally determined contribution and reflect its highest possible ambition. So I referred to Article 4.1 a little earlier, and that says again that in order to achieve the long-term temperature goal, parties aim to reach global peaking of emissions as soon as possible and to undertake rapid reductions thereafter. But it continues then as follows to say this: so as to achieve a balance between human emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. And this goes to what is referred to now as negative emissions, and put another way, a form of geoengineering. And this is actually the heart of the Paris Agreement, and on one view, it's not good. It's a black heart. So I'll turn to that black heart now. So again, to achieve the agreement's temperature goal, states aim to reach a global emissions peak as soon as possible, and then to make rapid emissions reductions to achieve a balance between human emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the period from 2050 to 2100. And it's not perhaps the best expression, because to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, emissions have to be cut urgently and significantly. But that's not what Article 2, and that's not what the Paris Agreement requires, as I've just set out. Rather, it's now understood clearly by all governments that that Article 4.1, the article that I just mentioned, is meant to reflect the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fifth assessment report, which states that emissions will need to go to zero and then below, so what's called negative emissions, in the second half of the century. Although again, that's not what Article 4.1 says directly. So that after COP21 in Paris, a range of prominent scientists from around the world, and it's actually really quite remarkable, have all argued that because of what they call the Paris failure, the world's only chance of saving itself from rampant global warming is a giant push into technologies that seek to cool the planet by manipulating the Earth's climate system. And that's geoengineering, so deliberate, large-scale intervention in the Earth's natural systems to deal with climate change. And that's what Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement appears to lead to, in referring to the achievement again of a balance between human emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. So in terms of that phrase then, what does it mean? So it's been noted that because, of course, forests and other vegetation naturally sequester carbon, and because this carbon pool has been depleted through deforestation and land clearing, the goal refers to the fact that increased sequestration can remove emissions from the atmosphere. Probably telling you nothing that you don't already know. But a balance effectively means the same as net zero, so that human emissions from any sector will be compensated for by the same level of removals. So given that in some sectors, and agriculture is probably the best example, it'll be impossible to bring emissions to zero, this balance will be required to stabilise atmospheric emissions. Although, of course, again, it's actually how quickly and how deeply fossil fuel emissions are reduced that will ultimately determine the level of temperature rise. So in the mitigation chapter in the IPCC's fifth assessment report, the latest report from the IPCC revealed that to achieve even a recognisably normal future climate, the models they reviewed relied not only in drastically reducing emissions in the future, but also on widespread use of technology that can remove some of the carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. So most of the IPCC models, that's 101 of 116 models, incorporated some sort of negative emissions technological fix. And negative emissions, again, means a form of geoengineering specifically referred to in terms of COP21, known as carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, the aim of which is to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, directly countering the increased greenhouse effect. And of course, that technology loomed large in Paris, notwithstanding that it's currently non-existent, or largely unexplored in terms of scientific research. And at this stage, the only approach to sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere mentioned by the IPCC as anywhere near-term available is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, most oftenly referred to as BECCS, B-E-C-C-S, not to be confused with BECCS. Can you get BECCS now? B-E-X? Well, no, I was thinking I could remember my father having BECCS in a little yellow box. And you'd put it in water, would you dissolve it? Anyway, I'm getting it. So BECCS involves producing biomass in massive amounts and either refining it into liquid biofuels or burning it for electricity and heat, while also capturing the resulting emissions and burying them underground. The IPCC acknowledges risks and uncertainties associated with large-scale BECCS, and indeed in a recent Biofuel Watch report, reference is made to reliance on BECCS to address the climate change problem as analogous to counting on a visit from carbon extracting extraterrestrials from another planet. And in the conversation a couple of weeks ago, Dooley and Stabinsky note that options for negative emissions are severely limited by the scale of land required. And they also note that of the scenarios in the IPCC database with a 50% or greater chance of limiting warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, about 85% of those models assume large-scale uptake of negative emissions. And of course, for 1.5 degrees, which is the lower end of the COP21 Paris Agreement target, all scenarios rely on even larger volumes of negative emissions. So just by way of conclusion, before I make a couple of comments about Australia in Paris, the Tyndall Centre, I referred to the Tyndall Centre on Climate Change Research at the beginning, says this: the unquestioned reliance on negative emissions technologies to deliver on the Paris goals is the greatest threat to the new agreement. Yet negative emissions technologies received no direct reference throughout the 32-page package. Despite this, the framing of the 2 degrees goal, and even more that 1.5 degrees goal, is premised on the massive uptake of BECCS sometime in the latter half of this century. Tyndall Centre concludes that the scale of this particular assumption is quite breathtaking. So EcoCarbon Incorporated, which is my NGO, had some association with Australian officials and other Australian delegates in Paris, and it appears that Australia was mostly constructive in the Paris negotiations. So on information from the Climate Institute based in Australia, it appears again that Australia was mostly constructive. It supported keeping global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and that pursuit of a 1.5 degrees target. It also, I understand, placed particular importance on the importance of those 5-year reviews. Australia will contribute about $1 billion over the next 5 years to help the world's poorest nations participate in climate change solutions. But I do understand from the Climate Institute that our finance contributions falls short of our commitment to scale up contributions to the goal of $100 billion each year, every year from 2020. I also gather that it also goes no higher than our annual contributions from 2010 to 2013, while other countries like Canada and Germany are doubling their commitment. Australia's INDC, which of course, as we know, is not legally binding, either domestically or internationally, is a 26 to 28% reduction in emissions by 2030 against a 2005 year baseline. That's not consistent with the 2 degrees target, but then whose INDC is. And of course, we have one of the world's most emissions intensive economies. So just by way of conclusion then, Lenore Taylor, writing in the Guardian newspaper, has noted that Greg Hunt, the then minister, spent his time in Paris continuing to pretend that his emissions reduction fund is a carbon price, and also an idea being adopted around the world. But the experts, when asked, said that reverse auctions like the ERF were useful additions to a carbon price, but not a good primary policy to drive down emissions. The bottom line, it concludes, is that if we're to meet our 2030 target, then the ERF is not going to cut it. And final point, it's actually quite remarkable because we know, Australia knows, more about setting up and then operating and then dismantling an emissions trading scheme or a price on carbon. At both the state and the federal level, it's twice at the federal level than any other country in the world. If you want to know about putting a price on carbon at the national, state or territory level, come to Australia because we know more about doing that than literally any other country. And now we have the Emissions Reduction Fund, the ERF, kind of like a bastard child of an emissions trading scheme. And I suspect that in climate change legal circles and in climate change policy circles, in an ideal world, the ERF is no one's idea of a good time. So thanks.